Good morning, everybody, and welcome to all of you to the second day of Free to Be Anywhere in the Universe. First I'll introduce myself. I'm Natasha Lightfoot, and I am an Associate Professor of History and also a Faculty Fellow of IRAAS. But I just wanted to first just say how wonderful it is to have this intellectual fellowship of so many impressive scholars that already over the first day has enriched our minds and shown us the undeniable influence that a Black Studies framework has, and that it has had on a number of fields of inquiry. We're here this weekend to celebrate the wonderful milestone of 25 years of IRAAS as a galvanizing and an independent space within Columbia for producing imaginative work on Black experiences and cohering a welcoming community for Black thinkers. I know that we can all agree that Columbia, as an experience for many of us, would not have been the same, or really might not have been survivable without the clearing that IRAAS has provided for so many of us to just be our full and brilliant selves. It's also the very right time to be having this celebration, as the work of IRAAS will now have even greater impact going forward as it feeds into our new Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, the formation of which seals the critical importance of Black studies on campus by endowing it with that institutional power to hire and tenure faculty and produce PhDs that will continue to innovate and expand upon all of these conversations we're having here now and many others that are happening in the field. All of this thanks to the awe-inspiring leadership of Farrah Griffin, who always deserves special mention when we talk about the intersection of what IRAAS has done and what AAADS will do in the near future. It's fitting then to continue our commemoration of these milestones through today's amazing lineup of panels, which include an examination of the overlapping intellectual genealogies that have built Black studies, a look at political solidarities and community formations in the global Black diaspora during the past and present, and the exploration of the generative effects of various strains of theory for understanding Black subjectivities and our vexed relationship to modernity. We'll end today's proceedings with what's sure to be a very incredible conversation between the esteemed artist and cinematographer Arthur Jaffa and Barnard's Tina Camp, a formidable scholar of the visual arts of the African diaspora. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for lending your hearts and your minds to this gathering. With that, I want to get started by introducing our panelists for our first panel of the day, which is on the genealogies of Black studies. And so the chair for our session is Frank Guridy, who is a professor of history and in African American studies. To the left of him is Jafari Allen, who's the director of Africana Studies and associate professor of anthropology at the University of Miami. To his left is Juliet Hooker, and she is, hold on, give me a second. She's a professor of political science at Brown University. And to her left is Minkah Makalani, who is the director of the John Warfield Center for African and African American Studies and associate professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas. And so with that, we'll get started. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can I be heard? Yes. Thank you, Professor Lightfoot. It's a pleasure to be colleagues with her in the history department, fellow Caribbeanist, Black studies scholar, comrades in that space and in IRAAS and now AAADS. So the bios for the esteemed panelists are in your program there, but I feel the need to just give some introductory remarks here. So Bob Gooding-Williams and I decided that we wanted to have a session that reflected some of the trends and influential traditions in Black studies, right? Certainly this is not an exhaustive conversation, but we wanted to pick people who've been doing innovative work for a long time, who have a sense of the field institutionally and also from a scholarly standpoint. And so we decided to sort of frame this session around the intersections between Black queer studies, Black hemispheric, Caribbean-oriented Black radical studies, right? So this is by no means an exhaustive exploration of genealogies of Black studies, but we wanted to give us a sense of the field from the perspective of these esteemed colleagues. I just want to say a few more things. So the session examines distinct and overlapping genealogies of Black studies. It brings together leading scholars who work in different iterations of Black African-American studies, panelists who draw from their path-breaking research to speak about the trajectories of Black studies in their own subfields and in the larger field at this historical moment. I want to say I'm delighted to be here. I'm in my 4th year here at Columbia, and it is an exciting time to be here, particularly in this world of departmentalizing Black studies. We have an extraordinary opportunity to remake our own world of scholarship, but also the institution. And even bigger than that, the institution's relationship to Harlem, right? And so I'm compelled to call out the fact that while we are in this extraordinary, beautiful space at the forum, we always need to be aware of the ways in which this space reflects this celebration of this moment of Black studies, but also its complicated relationships with the surrounding neighborhood. As a good Black studies scholar, I feel like I have to say that. And so this is a moment of celebration, but it's also a moment of crisis and struggle. You might be following recently, we've had some incidents on the Barnard Columbia campus. I don't mean to rain on our parade, but I want us to recall that we are in a moment of struggle, right? And the best of Black studies has always been engaged in the issues we've been struggling about since we were brought over here a long time ago from Africa, okay? So I want to say a little bit more about our panelists before we proceed. We're going to go sort of in the order from sort of your left to right. I want to start with Dr. Jafari Allen, who is the author of the award-winning book. He's got this real slim bio in your program, but that does not reflect his greatness at all. He was the author of the award-winning book, Vincent Amos, The Erotics of Black Self-Making in Cuba, which posed an audacious question. What happens when we look at the Cuban Revolution and Cuban society from the perspective of Black queer subjects? Nobody had done that work before. And I know this because that's the field that I cut my teeth on a long time ago. And so Professor Allen's done extraordinary work. He taught at the University of Texas, Austin for a long time. He was at Yale University. He's now Director of Africana Studies and Professor of Anthropology at the University of Miami, which is an interesting place to work, as I'm sure he might share with you at some point. He's working on new projects, one of them called After Revolution, Before Freedom. It's a project that is composed of a book forthcoming from Duke University Press in 2020. He's also working on There's a Disco Ball Between Us, a Black Gay Theory of Living, which is a critical meditation on Black queer habits of mind, taking up cultural expression in politics since the early 1980s. This is going to be an extraordinary book when it comes out. I'm looking forward to reading it. So Dr. Allen has done path-breaking research. He's done the administrative stuff. He's done the scholarship, and it's a real delight to have him with us today. So Professor Allen.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Farah, and thank you, IRAAS, and all of you for being here. Thank you so much to my best friend Sharon and to Sean for all of your work to bring me to this moment. I could go on thanking you, but I have timed this so that I could be disciplined. And because I'm at home in New York, I'm going to talk like a New Yorker. I'm going to talk really fast, and you're going to understand me, which is really great, right? So I was afraid of raining on parade also, but now that you've already rained, and forgive me, I'm going to read. The unruly branch of Black studies genealogy that I want to meditate on today, more a rhizome than a branch, is not academic as such, but rather an example of the Black radical intellectual tradition in which Black studies resides. This wonderful occasion for this conference presents a good time to ask ourselves again, I'm supposed to use this thing, right? Mm-hmm. Thank you. To ask ourselves again why we're here in the first place. What interventions do we aspire to deploy? What work have we come to do? In M. Jackie Alexander's language, who are you? Why did you come? Who do you walk with? I'm taking seriously the call of the conference, Farah's provocation after Tony, to be free anywhere in the universe. I hear Tony K. Bambara's mini ransom sounding like Audrey and Pat from the ether. Now here I am, and there I am, and all I am, free to be anywhere at all in the universe. The question echoes back and fixes us with, are you doing your work? Don't you want to be free? Yes, you. What are you doing to be free? Are you sure, sweetheart? a lot of heaviness. We, the Black gay living, do so in epidemic time. In the opening line of A Calendar of Loss, Dagmawi Wubshet tells us, "For the living, there is no constituency as formative as the dead." The epidemic dead, that is, are subjectifying political subjects themselves. In my new work, I turn to those I call the anthological folks of the long 1980s, the epidemic dead and the living, Melvin called them, in order to make good Black gay sense of the current moment, attempting to remember a Black gay politics that may be necessary for all of us, for all of our futures. The methodology, a counterpoise against what Melvin called double cremation and toward better politics. I draw the long 1980s roughly from 1979, the year that Conditions 5, the Black women's issue, was published, months before the first cases of what we now call HIV/AIDS were identified, and the globally consequential neoconservatism and neoliberalism of Reagan and Thatcher first began to coagulate, to around 1995 when the Black Nations Queer Nations Conference took place. During the long 1980s, Black, lesbian, gay, gender non-binary, and bisexual folks in the US began to make sense of the detritus of the 1960s and early 70s, during which revolution seemed palpably imminent and freedom an attainable goal. But revolutionary disappointment had begun to set in. Even those who wanted to recuperate the would-be Black nation would have to contend with the apparent failure of many revolutionary projects in the face of rearticulated capital and its political apparatus headquartered in the US. Moreover, the gender and class politics of these revolutionary or otherwise anti-colonial new nations and nationalist movements in North America would begin to be called to account. The connection between these two things, the failure of revolutionary movements to bring about a totalized new world against the global reach and strength of neocolonialism, and their failure of imagination to see their queer kin, is rarely read in the same frame, but it ought to be. It seems clear now, belatedly perhaps, that in the anthological habits of mind and quality of analysis of radical Black lesbian feminists undergird a politics of accomplice that might have made us all free. For David Scott, our current political time is marked by mourning the failure of total revolution that seemed belated but still possible by the 1980s. He argues that revolution and tragedy have been between them an uncanny but nevertheless adhesive intimacy, his words, adhesive intimacy, offering what he calls an attunement to tragedy. He eruditely parses this as the throes of a great tragedy. The Afro-pessimist position would insist on the impossibility of socially dead Black folks launching a Gramscian war of position in any case. Still, the catastrophes of the long 1980s, marked by reversals of the gains of the decolonizing generation, seem no less evidence what Pat Parker reckoned as imperialist forces in the world finding themselves backed against the wall, no longer able to control the world, and they are getting desperate, she said. Demonstrating the necessary pragmatic untimeliness of Black queer time, she calls fellow travelers throughout the globe toward revolutionary action. We are facing the most critical time in the history of the world, she says. These are out of order. I just want you to hear Pat's voice, and maybe you won't. Pat, where you at? You're not gonna hear Pat's voice. This.
Tell us what Pat said.
Yes, Pat. So at the 1980 Becoming Visible, the first Black lesbian conference, Pat Parker laid down a radical challenge to single-issue liberal feminist politics, quipping that if the passage of the ERA means that I'm going to become an equal participant in the exploitation of the world, that I'm going to bear arms against other third world people who are fighting to reclaim what is rightfully theirs, then I say fuck the ERA. Her response to Audrey's global, quote, racism, destruction, and borrowed sameness is a principled refusal of participation. What is our current refusal of participation? What is our current response? Written in 1978, Parker's typically biting and chillingly current Tour America illustrates an articulation of the experience of black so-called citizens in the US. And she says in this work, a commercial says, tour the US, I'll need a couple of things. And then she says, gas masks in LA, other things. Then that's why I want you to hear her. And then she says, police guards in the South, guards to guard me from the police in the North, and goes on in wordplay that only a brilliant poet can do, that I am not she, right? It is in this rich intellectual creative environment that the anthology became and is now the major repository of long 1980s political philosophy. In the anthological tradition, a collection purposefully makes a multi-vocal statement of the political and aesthetic commitments of a particular group of artists, scholars, or activists engaged in what they, or at least the editor, believe is a collective project. The editor, therefore, is a sort of consensus builder, an arbiter, a keen observer, and a laborer, as well as a shaper of discourses. In the book, I try to go through some examples of what I mean by anthological, but you can get this just thinking about, rather than a monograph, that the thinking is one that is gathering people together who may have various styles, who may have various things to say, but all under the same color, in having a common project, not a unifying project, maybe a harmonious project. In the last line of her essay in the inaugural anthology of Black women's writing, The Black Woman, edited by Toni Cade Bambara, legendary jazz singer, I'm not gonna fool with that, legendary jazz singer and actor Abby Lincoln asked, who will revere the Black woman? Of course, lesbianism and bisexuality could scarcely speak its name in that 1970 landmark anthology. But by 1979, Lorraine Bethel and Barbara Smith's Conditions 5, the Black women's issue, inaugurated a long-lasting tradition of Black lesbian publishing, which continued throughout the long 1980s with Barbara Smith's Kitchen Table Press, Lisa Moore's Redbone Press. To Ms. Lincoln's trenchant query, who will revere the Black woman? Black lesbian cultural production and habits of mind and bodies work in the long 1980s enthusiastically responds, sister, we will. Even a cursory look will illustrate that Black lesbians have most enthusiastically and consistently shown up for the signal honor to revere other Black women. And among lesbians, those self-described as dykes and bulldaggers are the first to be baited and targeted for that specific form of anti-lesbian misogynoir. These individuals do not easily or comfortably fit into commoditized slots of lesbian chic, bourgeois intellectual, or Black femme earth mother. Thus, their embodiments in politics can sometimes make everybody else in the room so uncomfortable. I'm using my Drake voice to make a point about the cost of unapologetically and unreservedly choosing Black women, femmes, soft butches, and otherwise. Black bulldaggers and dykes built this tradition, anthologized themselves into spaces of multiplicity and productive, messy, sexy difference, not fracture, not disengagement or disaffiliation, not non-being. But this is, quote, never easy, nor quick, nor pretty, as Pat has already told y'all. To be anthologized is to be called and culled together under one cover. The cover or title may not easily fit for each of us or each one of our genre choices, styles, or language, but we consent to gather together to at least explore our common through lines, our stitches. I haven't showed you that video. Read it in the book, it's gonna be fabulous. Our stitches, Kevin Aviance would say, hoping for generative connections to our individual projects. I'm just gonna use just time, I'm not gonna say more. I want you just to hear this bit. We began with Conditions 5 in 1979. My long 1980s begins in 1979. You've got to end, the historians tell me, you've got to choose and you've got to end the long 1980s somewhere. I end in 1995 because three things happened. A volcano exploded in Montserrat, setting off a tremendous migration of people out of Montserrat to the US, to Canada, to Europe, et cetera, that I follow through two people in the book. The other thing that happened is that the Palladium closed. And speaking of universities taking over spaces, right? The Palladium closed, and the night that the Palladium closed, Kevin Aviance was there at that moment as the disco drop falls. And Kevin Aviance told me about being able to see as the ball drops, in each facet, girlfriends of his who had died, waving to him and then clapping and saying, "All right, girl." That moment of there's a disco ball between us. My book is called A Disco Ball Between Us because of those reflections and those refractions. The other thing that happened in 1995 was the Black Nations Queer Nations Conference. And the Black Nations Queer Nations Conference is the end of the long 1980s, but the beginning of Black queer studies. And it is the beginning of Black queer studies, by my accounting, because of the work of two people, because of Kathy Cohen and M. Jackie Alexander, not only as theorists, but as people who were in the room organizing a conference, herding cats, raising money, right? So I want you to hear, there it is. Oh, that's the beginning where you don't know your history, girl, but we don't have time for that. There's Pat. How is this happening? Can the whiz help me? Okay. I'm trying to have you all hear 2 minutes. Play this video embedded, not that video. That's a good one, but not that one, but this one. Can we play this? You want to hear? Go ahead. Yeah. How do I do that? Do I press green?
There it is. Now we need sound.
What she's doing is she's proving that what I said was right. She's talking about just as, and you know Jackie Alexander's work, just as we are perpetually, we are vigilant against nationalism, and we are vigilant against unity. We are not vigilant against, but we look toward forms of sociality that are difficult and that are work. And she says it 7 times, I've counted. Work, work. She says, it is work that this is work that you have done, it is work that you will do today, it is work you will do tomorrow. If you watch the whole film, it is work, 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 constantly work. If you read my book,
it's
every
community
3 pages.
that has informed the very foundation of this conference. But in a real way, community absolutely does not mean the absence of struggle. The conference is a working conference, and it means for us, and it has meant for us, moving beyond mere definitions. The conference is about practice. The practice that brought you here, the practice that we will do for the next 2 days, and the practice beyond. The question for us, and there are several, is how do we make sense out of this anti-human climate in which we live? And what are we going to do about it? We know that we have the power to develop a vision and to move beyond that vision, and that we could be strong in a vision for social justice.
In the 1 minute I have left, I want to suggest that when we look for projects, when we look to see what we are about in Black studies, we need not continue to look to the French. I'm here at Columbia, so I remember my advisor, Sherry Orton, used to say she would always do it with a hand, the French, right? We need not look always to the French. We need not look always to the sexiest or the newest thing. We need not always look to the most dense or obtuse or flowery thing, even if it's something that Jafari wrote because he thought it was pretty. We've had marching orders that have not been thought about. I started to begin, and I'll just say this at the end. I wasn't going to do this. I got a text the other day from a grad student who is a friend who was talking about reading something that was very frustrating to him. And he says, Kathy, talking about Kathy Gilman, Kathy is a sage. And I said, what do you mean? I was like, oh, of course she's a sage. What has the oracle said? And he said, no, it's not that she said anything. I'm reading this book that was published this year that is saying this, that, and the other thing that could have been helped if they had only read work that is now 20-something years old. And as a teacher, this happens over and over and over again to me. He was horrified because he's a reader. And then he said, which was the thing that struck me, is he said, I wonder what it feels like to be lauded but ignored. And I want to suggest that that's what we have done. We have dishonored the people who have brought us the furthest. We have dishonored people who didn't have salaries because didn't have tenure, didn't have appointments. What they had was keen analysis. What they had was bodies they put on the line. What they had was bodies that were broken. And what do we have? What do we owe? Who do we walk with? What are we going to do? Are you sure, sweetheart? Thank you.
So you take a breath. Hold on. Okay. Our next presenter is Professor Juliet Hooker, who is Professor of Political Science at Brown University. She's a political theorist specializing in multiculturalism, racial justice, Latin American political thought, Black political thought, Afro-descendant and indigenous politics in Latin America. She's the author of Race and Politics of Solidarity from Oxford University Press in 2009, and Theorizing Race in the Americas, Douglas, Sarmiento, Du Bois, and Vasconcelos, also with Oxford University Press 2017, which was a recipient of the American Political Science Association's 2018 Ralph Bunche Award for the Best Book in Ethnic and Cultural Pluralism, and the 2000 Best Book Award of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. Professor Hooker has done it all, administrating, directing, and co-directing Latin American studies at the University of Texas, Austin. She's currently working on a book tentatively entitled Black Grief, White Grievance, and it's a study of contemporary racial politics in the United States. Professor Juliet Hooker.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank, and everyone else for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here and to be a part of this celebration of the amazing work that IRAAS has done and the work that it will continue to do as a department. I should know, after more than a decade or more of being friends, that I should never follow Professor Allen on a panel, but I will do my best. Que mi canto, eco de nuestra voz, ayude a la siembra del grano para que el nuevo mundo americano renazca en el dolor, sepa reír en la angustia, tornar en fuego las cenizas, en chispa sol las cadenas de Changó. Sube a bordo de esta novela como uno de los tantos millones de africanos prisioneros en las naos negreras y siéntete libre aunque te aten las cadenas, desnúdate. Cualesquiera que sean tu raza, cultura o clase, no olvides que pisas la tierra de América, el nuevo mundo, la aurora de la nueva humanidad. Por lo tanto, hazte niño. Si encuentras fantasmas extraños, palabra, personaje, trama, tómalos como un desafío a tu imaginación. Olvídate de la academia, de los tiempos verbales, de las fronteras que separan la vida de la muerte. Porque en esta saga no hay más huella que la que tú dejes. Eres el prisionero el descubridor, el fundador, el libertador. Si descubres un vocablo misterioso, dale tu propia connotación, reinvéntala. Embárcate en la lectura y deja que el Ekba, el abridor de caminos, te revele tus futuros pasos ya escritos en las tablas de Ifá desde antes de nacer. Tarde o temprano tenías que enfrentarte a esta verdad. La historia del hombre negro en América es tan tuya como la del indio o la del blanco que lo acompañarán a la conquista de la libertad de todos. The two epigraphs that frame my remarks that I just read are from Chango el Gran Putas, or Chango the Biggest Badass, the epic of 500 years of exile, enslavement, and resistance of African peoples in the Americas by the Afro-Colombian intellectual, medical doctor, and novelist Manuel Zapata Olivella, born in 1920 and who passed away in 2004. The first quote is from the opening poem directed to the Muntu, or American Black folks, American in the hemispheric sense, and the second is from Zapata Olivella's instructions to his readers, in which he tells them, open your mind, decolonize yourself, and think in ways that you have never thought before. Chango el Gran Putas is an epic account of the Afro-American experience that opens with Africa and the transatlantic slave trade, where Black folk are cursed by their gods and sent into exile to the Americas. And the white wolves are merely the instruments who carry out Chango's curse. Throughout the more than 600-page text that spans a variety of genres, it can be read as a modern tragedy set in the New World rather than Greek antiquity, or as a monumental work of historical fiction. Zapata Olivella highlights the history of maroon communities in Cartagena, the Haitian Revolution, Simón Bolívar's fears of pardocracia, the heroism of the struggles of blacks for equality in the Republican era in 19th century Colombia, and the struggle against Jim Crow racial segregation in the United States in the 20th century. I open with Zapata Olivella's Chango because it is emblematic of the hemispheric reach and aspirations of Afro-Latin American political thought. And that leads to the 2 points I wish to highlight in my remarks today. One is that we need to pay more attention to the transnational exchanges among Black thinkers across the Americas. And the second is that we need to resituate Afro-Latin American political thought as central to Black political thought. Afro-Latin American thinkers have not been, I think, sufficiently acknowledged within most accounts, certainly of Latin American political thought. Despite the richness and complexity of this tradition, and despite the growing attention it is beginning to receive by intellectual historians, it remains understudied and underutilized. And the folks on the panel here with me are actually important exceptions to that, that trend. And at the same time, while certain Caribbean intellectuals, such as Frantz Fanon or C.L.R. James or Aimé Césaire, are included in accounts of the Black intellectual tradition, the contributions of Afro-Latin American thinkers are much less usually acknowledged. So the aim of much of my work has been to resituate Afro-Latin American thinkers within the canons of both Latin American thought and Black political thought. And I want to begin by turning to the first point, which is about, I think, one way to think about how we resituate Latin America within Black studies is to think about the ways in which African American thinkers, right, from the United States have turned to Latin America for inspiration and the way in which it has played an important part in their work. And I've done this, one way of doing this, which I have done, is to look at, and I do this in Theorizing Race in the Americas, to show how two African-American thinkers, Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois, draw on Latin American sources and ideas to formulate, in the case of Douglass, notions of Black freedom and multiracial democracy, and in the case of Du Bois, to draw on notions of racial mixture that are in contrast to readings of him as having an an essentialist conception of Black identity. So I'm going to say a little bit about what I do in those readings of Douglass and Du Bois, and I begin with Du Bois. So I read Du Bois as a hemispheric thinker and I want to preface this by saying that, you know, part of this is a reaction to the way in my discipline in political theory, we reify certain texts and certain moments, and I think do a disservice to African American political thought by reading it as too US-centric, right? So people read Souls, and that's Du Bois. People read the autobiographies, in Douglass's case, and in particular the narrative, and that's Douglass. And there's not enough, even in Du Bois's case, which you would think it would be difficult to not recognize, right, his commitments beyond the United States, that move continues to be made. So in my book, one of the things that I do is turn to his novel, Dark Princess, which envisions an anti-colonial revolution of the darker peoples of the world via an interracial romance between two characters from the global South. And the two main characters are an African American, Matthew Towns, and this Indian princess, Kautilya. And they come together after, you know, engaging in this various forms of Black politics. Matthew is charged by the Council of the Darker Peoples of the World, whom he meets through Kautilya, to come and create this revolution. The novel was published in the 1920s, to create this revolution in the United States. And so he, at one point, is working with a Marcus Garvey-like character, and they have this plan to bomb this train that's carrying these Ku Klux Klan leaders on their way to a convention in Chicago. And he goes to prison for that, and then eventually is released and becomes a part of the Black political machine in Chicago, and then becomes a labor organizer. And Kautilya has also becomes involved in various struggles. So eventually they get together, right? It's a romance, and they have a child. The child is born in Virginia in the cabin of Matthew's mother, who's described as the descendant of enslaved people in the United States. And Kautilya tells him that working in the South, right, in the US, is like he will be able to work with all of the strands of people who are struggling, darker peoples, because they all come together in this kind of hemispheric understanding that she has of the South as connected to the Caribbean and to Latin America and to other transnational spaces. Now, what I think is interesting about Dark Princess is that I think from it and from other writings of Du Bois on mixture and miscegenation, as he called it, we get a different view of his account of Blackness and of racial identity than what he puts forward, for example, in The Conservation of Races, which the essay that has been the basis of so much scholarship on Du Bois's supposed racial essentialism. And I argue that this turning to his writings on mixture allow us to read Du Bois as a theorist of mestizaje, like his Latin American counterparts, José Vasconcelos, the Mexican philosopher, Gilberto Freire, the promoter of the idea of racial democracy in Brazil. And I argued that that different vantage point allows us to understand his arguments about racial identity, Black politics, and transnational solidarity in a different vein, and also unsettles our reading of these other accounts of a mixture by these Latin American thinkers. So turning to Douglass, the case for Douglass as a hemispheric thinker is even clearer than for Du Bois, because while Du Bois did not write much about Latin America, with some exceptions that I can talk about, Douglass did write and work in the Caribbean, right? There's, of course, a lot of scholarship now on Douglass's lifelong interest in Haiti, his appointment there as ambassador in the 1890s, his admiration for the Haitian Revolution, and his more problematic endorsement of plans for the annexation of Santo Domingo in the 1870s, what is now the Dominican Republic. Less noted has been his interest in Central America, specifically Nicaragua and the Mosquito Kingdom, which in the 1840s and 1850s were the sites of African American immigration. I argue in the book, I show that in Douglass's newspaper at the time, Frederick Douglass's paper, he publishes all these accounts of African American migrants who go to this space and see it as a place and marvel at the fact that this is a place that has, the Mosquito Kingdom has a black ruler, they have black policemen, and there's all of these, there's this, he publishes this review by James McCune Smith of a travel narrative by a white US traveler who goes to Nicaragua, and McCune Smith uses it to argue against condemnations of black capacity and says, look, this is a place where black people are part of the government. You have this kind of multiracial democracy. And of course, they extol it in these very romanticized terms, but I argue in the book that what we can see, despite their misunderstandings of what was actually happening in Nicaragua and the Mosquito Kingdom, that it shows that Central America and the Caribbean serve as important models of black freedom and multiracial democracy for African Americans at a time when Douglass could not find those in the US. Now, to be sure, Douglass and his contemporaries like Delaney had romanticized visions of race relations in Central America that gloss over complex racial hierarchies in the region, but nevertheless, it shows the central role black spaces in the other Americas played in the formulation of African American visions of freedom. And I think these are important examples of the way the relationship between African Americans and Latin America was not simply unidirectional, right, but went in both directions. And it's even more complicated if we think about all those, for example, central black feminist theories who come from the Caribbean, right? And so there's a way in which we have to think about the multi-directionality of these encounters. So I want to turn in the time I have left to talk about Afro-Latin American thinkers specifically. And this, some of this has appeared in work that Frank and I have done together, where we've argued that Afro-Latin American thought is a diverse and complex tradition, and has many strands, and black thinkers in Latin America have disagreed about a number of different issues. But I want to turn to a brief discussion here of Afro-Latin American feminism to illustrate the way that black feminist theory could be enriched by drawing on this rich archive. Since the era of slavery, Afro-Latin American women made important contributions to black struggles in Latin America, yet Afro-Latin American thought has been a male-dominated field, at least in terms of those intellectuals whose contributions have been most recognized. If Afro-Latin American thinkers have been seen as marginal to Latin American intellectual production, the contributions of Afro-Latin American women have been doubly invisibilized. In response, Afro-Latin American feminists have developed an intersectional analysis that challenges the silence on race in mainstream feminist movements in the region and the lack of attention to gender within many black movements. Afro-Latin American feminism thus envisions a radical decolonization of black political thought by challenging its long-standing masculinist presuppositions. As Sonia Alvarez and Kia Caldwell argued in a recent issue of Meridians, quote, Afro-descendant feminisms have advanced radical reimaginings of not only mainstream or hegemonic Latin American feminisms, but also of race, gender, sexuality, democracy, health, development, cultural production, generation, citizenship, and other issues and ideas that are central to feminist theory, end quote. Afro-Brazilian intellectuals in particular have been at the forefront of Afro-Latin American feminism, and I want to point here to a figure that I think is emblematic of the way in which the contributions of these black feminists in Latin America have been under-recognized. So the intellectual activist and poet Beatriz Nascimento, she was born in 1942, died in 1995, was one of the early theoreticians of the significance of quilombos as a model of political praxis for 20th century black movements. She also formulated an intersectional analysis of the situation of black women in Brazil. Yet compared to her male counterparts, Nascimento's work has not received much scholarly attention to date. despite the profound influence her theoretical insights, which were developed from ethnographic work in Quilombo communities, has had on the subsequent recuperation of the Quilombo as an important conceptual and territorial space by Black activists in Brazil. And many of us might be familiar, for example, with Abdias do Nascimento's, right, essay on Quilombismo, which appeared in 1980. They're not related. And of course, he actually draws on a lot of her work, but her work we don't know, and his essay appeared in English, her work hasn't been translated. So there's also a kind of politics of translation that's important to think about here. Beatriz Nascimento, she rejected the idea of quilombos as only rural spaces, arguing that favelas could be considered quilombos insofar as they constituted autonomous spaces of Black liberation defined by migration and escape. She also developed an analysis of Brazilian racism amidst the myth of racial democracy, calling it emaranhão das sutilezas, or a tangle of deceit. Nascimento critiqued the lack of research on Afro-Brazilians as well as their near-total absence from Brazilian universities, arguing that they were only discussing conventional studies of slavery that depicted them as forced laborers with no agency. In contrast, she argued, slavery was a living past and that studies of the history of Black Brazilians had to be connected to contemporary discrimination. The slave quarters are still present, she wrote. And following in the footsteps of Nascimento, contemporary decolonial feminists such as Juliet Espinosa and Ochi Curiel have posited a decolonial feminism that can challenge the Eurocentric underpinnings of mainstream feminisms and the patriarchal and masculinist tendencies of Black political thought. Rather than using decolonial thought to reconceive Afro-Latin American feminism, however, contemporary Afro-Latin American feminists have posited Afro-Latin American feminism and Black feminism in the United States and indigenous feminism as forms of post-colonial theory themselves. So I think Afro-Latin American feminism thus points to new and exciting avenues in Black political thought. And I just want to end by saying that I think that today in Latin America, Black movements in many countries have spurred interest in the study of Afro-Latin American thought and in recovering the intellectual contributions of peoples of African descent in the region. In the academy, the consolidation of Afro-Latin American studies and the impact of calls to decolonize Latin American political thought, and so not to make that gesture of always turning to Europe, right, has contributed to the growing interest in this tradition, which is complex and rich. Black thinkers in Latin America have disagreed about what it means to be Afro-Latin American, and they have crafted multiple visions of what inclusion into existing states would look like, or alternatively, of how to forge autonomous spaces for Black liberation. They have debated whether Black freedom can be achieved without decolonizing Latin American political thought, and indeed Black political thought itself. And so we have much to learn from engaging with this tradition, and in that spirit, I want to end with a selection from a poem by the Afro-Brazilian writer Conceição Evaristo called Women's Voices. Quote, "The voice of my mother whispered echoes of revolt. In the very end of the others' kitchen, under the trusses of Weiss's dirty linen, along the dusty road towards the slum. The voice of my daughter gathers within itself speech and action, yesterday, today, now. In my daughter's voice, the resonance will be heard, the echo of freedom, life." Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hooker. Before I introduce our third panelist, well, I'll start introducing him and then I'll stop the introduction for a second. So our third panelist is Professor Minkah Makalani, who is the director of the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies and associate professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. So I'll stop the introduction at this moment. I'm mentioning Texas because we on this panel either have worked or have worked significant time at the University of Texas, Austin, and we're very much engaged in Black Studies projects there in our own research, but also in the building of Black Studies And I would say I must call out Ted Gordon, who was our visionary leader, who himself was doing work on black populations and mining black forms of knowledge in Latin America, and his work on Central America. And I think his influence has been on many of us here, both from practically as scholars trying to make it in academia, but also in shaping a Black Studies project that's anchored in black spaces in the other Americas, as Professor Hooker just said. So I think in some ways our own work, like many of us, right, is shaped through our engagement with people who are more senior, who help set an intellectual agenda, but also were about program building and generosity. So Professor Gordon really deserves just a brief moment of round of applause for him. You know, we in the Northeast like to think we're bringing up here in the Ivy League, but there have been many Black Studies projects all over this country, and I think UT is a place that, you know, we didn't remake a Jim Crow institution to something different, but we certainly tried to follow our marching orders, as Professor Allen said earlier. Okay. Professor Makalani is the author of In the Cause of Freedom, Radical Black Internationalism from Harlem to London, 1917 to 1939. His articles have appeared in many publications, in many journals, Souls, Journal of African American History, Small Axe, South Atlantic Quarterly, among other places. He's currently working on a history of C.L.R. James's return to Trinidad during the 1958 to 62 period. He's working on a project, and he will speak about this today, tentatively titled Calypso Conquered the World, C.L.R. James and the Politically Unimaginable in Trinidad. Please join me in applause for Professor Makalani.
So I want to thank you all for coming today, and I want to especially thank Frank and Dr. Gooding-Williams for the invitation and the work that Farah and Kelly Jones have done, and as well Sean and Sharon and other logistical work to get us here. And so this paper today is something that grew out of a kind of accidental find in the archives. I was researching this first trip to Trinidad in C.L.R. James's paper, and this is a file about him teaching at Federal City College in Washington, D.C. And this was a program that was developed in 68, 69 by a SNCC activist, Jimmy Garrett, who had taken a position to lead up Black Studies. And so he developed this Black education program that he saw as turning Black Studies at Federal City College into a degree granting program. He thinks about inviting James. James accepts. He's going to start in the fall of 1969. So he sends him the program. James makes a number of marginal comments, but then he sees where his seminar on race and radicalism that he's been teaching at Northwestern University, he was brought the first time back in the US in 1968, since he was deported in 53. And they mention his course as one of the key courses in the major, and he says in the margins, very simply but emphatically, 2 exclamation marks, "Not my course." And so when you think about James's life and his intellectual activity, you know, that seems really at odds with what we know of his political commitments. And then you think about his place in Black Studies. A number of the early Black Studies programs would have the Black Jacobins as a foundational text. People were sending him their programs for feedback on the curriculum. And so to say that just really seems kind of out of place. Now, when he arrives and begins teaching at Federal City College, Garrett and others have already left the university, and they established the Center for Black Education in Washington, D.C. And so James, he admired their focus on community education, but he would admit very early on that he failed to see anything distinctive about Black Studies. Now, 2 years later, giving lectures, a series of lectures at Michigan State University, he would get to the point of saying that anyone who dismissed Black Studies as narrowly focused on Black people was an idiot. So there's this growth or this change that happens. And while it's easy to dismiss his early declaration, "Not my course," which was in private, but nonetheless, it's a very humorous find in the archives, that this reflected maybe perhaps his unfamiliarity with the epistemological claims of the earliest efforts to establish Black Studies. His later defense of the project reveals, I think, his sense of Black Studies' political challenge to the nature of scholarship more generally, and a dilemma that confronted Black Studies then and as it does today. Now, I want to point out that I see his thinking about Black Studies and Black power as informed by 2 experiences. One, by 1969, he's witnessed a number of African and Caribbean nations gain their independence. As well, he's worked with Eric Williams' government in Trinidad and Tobago, where he also worked tirelessly on West Indies Federation, which ultimately failed as a project. So he's thinking about what it means to govern a post-colonial society by the time Black power emerges in the US. But he's also, when he goes back to Trinidad and to the Caribbean more generally, he's engaged with and influencing a group of intellectuals at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica who formed the West Indian Society for the Study of Social Issues. This was led by Lloyd Best. And then they would go on to form the New World Group. And this is a group of interdisciplinary and multi-genre artists, activists, and intellectuals like Best, Norman Girvan, Sylvia Winter, George Lamming, and Elsa Gouveia. And they are preoccupied in that project with the political, economic, social, and cultural future of Caribbean society after the failure of federation. So the questions that they're asking, you can see the influence of James, but it's also an intellectual project that is committed to the problems of solving the problems that confront Caribbean society outside of the university. So thinking about James's interaction with them, I want to suggest that his concern with Black studies in its earliest iterations are that it might follow too closely what happened when Black people assumed control of post-colonial governments. That rather than introduce a new approach to history, sociology, economics, literary studies, and artistic production, it would merely replicate standing epistemologies and seek power within institutions of higher education. So today I want to look at James's lectures on Black power and Black studies between 67 and 71, both in London and the United States, to flesh out what I believe are two fundamental questions that confront Black studies. One is a question of theory, and here I want to juxtapose theory to a practice of thinking. And the other, not unrelated, concerns the relationship between interdisciplinarity and the disciplines. It remains something of a curiosity that US-based studies of Black power, with rare exception, and in particular the work of Derek White, Kito Swan, and most recently Monique Badassi, largely gloss the ideas and activities of Caribbean intellectuals. In part, this is owed to a guiding concern in the field to track a longer history of Black power that culminates in, rather than begins with, Stokely Carmichael shouting Black power in Greenwood, Mississippi. While this approach has expanded our understanding of the political questions addressed by many Black power activists and located 1960s Black radical thought within a much longer historical arc, in doing so, it has also produced an exceptionalist narrative where Black power is presented as a legitimate African-American as opposed to just Black, a legitimate African-American and thus authentic US political current that proved influential and was thus exported to oppressed peoples around the world. And conceptually, this assumes a coherent body of ideas that emerge within a uniquely American context, an approach that obscures its polyvalent political commitments and motivations, as well as influences. Lost is how African and Caribbean national liberation movements raised critical questions about the nature of power that bore directly on how US-based activists viewed civil rights. At its most basic, the experience of African and Caribbean intellectuals with administrative decolonization demonstrated the pitfalls of Black people simply assuming control in formerly colonized states without altering those political structures. And in particular, in this period, C.L.R. James, who had spent nearly 15 years in the US, largely in Detroit, that this activity in both the Johnson Forest tendency, then correspondence and facing reality, brought him in contact with the range of Black radicals who would play important roles in the Revolutionary Union movement and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And I would suggest that there's a distinct character to those movements as opposed to other Black power formations that hasn't really been delved deeply enough. Now, while James never articulated a notion of Black power, by the time he returned to Trinidad in '58, he was preoccupied with how the Caribbean might elaborate a mode of freedom beyond Western democracy. Thus, when Stokely Carmichael called for Black power and began speaking internationally, James had been for years grappling with some of its central concerns. This was the context in which he delivered his first lectures on Black power in July and August of 1967, the first one at a Dialectics of Liberation conference where Carmichael was the main attraction, and later to a group at the West Indian Student Center. And in these lectures, James defended Carmichael against those who would paint him and Black power more generally as, quote, a sudden apparition, as some racist eruption from the depths of Black oppression and Black backwardness. Rather, he located Black power within a long tradition of Black thought that stretched from Du Bois and Marcus Garvey on up to George Padmore and Francis Fanon, concluding that it reflected, quote, the high peak of thought on the Negro question, which has been going on for over half a century. What was important here, however, was not that these figures addressed simply racial issues, but that they had set themselves to a range of questions that altered how anyone might think about the most advanced societies in the world. Quote, to properly understand the advanced position which Stokely Carmichael and the advocates of Black power hold today, James explained, one must view an intellectual like Du Bois as not, one must not view Du Bois as simply, quote, one of the greatest leaders of Negro emancipation, but one must instead view him as an intellectual who demonstrated how racial oppression threatened US political existence. And he believed Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, especially his discussion of the general strike, had so transformed the field of history that, quote, there is no noteworthy American historian writing today who does not owe a tremendous debt to Du Bois's work. And David Roediger has once echoed that sentiment with saying, to do American history, particularly Southern history, and you haven't read Black Reconstruction is akin to claiming you're a Christian, you haven't read the Bible. So while Padmore helped make African self-determination a reality, James argued that it was Fanon who pointed out that after independence, the struggle was not merely against imperialism, but, quote, against those native leaders who may have fought for independence but have become the enemy, end quote. Part of Black power's appeal for James involved its refusal to accept the idea that Black people in power was in itself revolutionary. He had seen in Trinidad the problems that this posed and hoped that administrative decolonization would provide an opportunity to bring about a new form of political association that could shed those familiar arrangements of the colonial order. Writing in '62, he explained that given Caribbean society was founded on those structures, it was, quote, a false and dangerous conception that we have been so educated by the British that the instinct for democracy is established among us. Caribbean political leaders knew they must win elections, he reasoned, but after that, quote, their concept and practice of government is that of the old colonialist governors. Post-independence Caribbean societies were replete with examples of this, from Bustamante's role in Bad Friday in 1963, to the 1968 barring of Walter Rodney's re-entering into Jamaica after he attended the '68 Black Writers Conference in Montreal, to Eric Williams placing James himself under house arrest in 1965 amid nationwide labor strikes, as well as Williams's labeling of Stokely Carmichael undesirable and barring him from Trinidad in 1967. James had long insisted that newly independent Caribbean nations, in discovering themselves, rather than imitating Britain and the US, must bring something new into the world. This required going beyond constitutional independence, and for James, direct democracy is a practice of freedom that would involve constituent assemblies and prolonged public engagements over the direction of Caribbean society offered such a possibility. While he often turned his attention to ancient Athens for a historical model of what he was after, he found Black power's ability to galvanize large segments of the Black community to challenge governmental bodies, not simply for political recognition, but to alter the very structure and function of government, compelling. Soon after he began teaching at Federal City College, he gave a lecture on Black studies to students and activists at Wayne State University in Detroit, where he offered his most sustained treatment of Black studies as an epistemological challenge to prevailing modes of thought. Though he did not believe that Black studies existed as such, still in 1969, he was convinced that, quote, when you look at what is taking place under the guise of Black studies in the United States, you realize what a fundamental position ought to be. Rejecting what we might today view as a neoliberal approach to university education that trains a Black elite, he pointed to the Black education program that Garrett developed at the FCC, in particular his emphasis on revolution as, quote, bringing an end to white supremacy, colonialism, and oppression embodied in Western ideas, and its commitment to nation building as an act of thinking about and ordering, quote, the conceptions and possibilities of future Black existence, defined in terms of human and material and historical cultural resources of the people. While James certainly agreed and brought outline with this program, his hesitation was its seeking federal funds. And this was because FCC ran by Congress. They were presenting this proposal to the college board, and then the board would have to take this to Congress. And so his thing was, you're gonna take to Congress a proposal for revolution and nation building. That's not gonna work. But it did. They got the funding. And then what was even more impressive to him was that they rejected. They refused to remain in Federal City College, and they established the Center for Black Education. And again, thinking about the relationship of the New World Group to the university system in the Caribbean, this, for him, modeled a manner of politically engaged scholarship. And this moves beyond kind of the vindicationist cataloging of Black people's contribution to Western civilization, to use James's language, to propose a way of rethinking history, politics, and freedom itself. Now, James was clear that HBCUs might be able to carry this work out, but in particular, he said Howard University could not. And he said this because, one, quote, the professor sitting down in his office and giving out his lectures 2 or 3 times a week and not involved in this kind of struggle, he cannot lead that kind of work. To understand and write about the French Revolution or Civil War, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, in light of Black power, he believed, quote, is an important part of Black studies. I cannot think of Black studies in any other way. Again, drawing on Du Bois and his own work, and thinking about the Industrial Revolution's impact on human society. He said that it was possible not merely because of the wealth produced by the slave trade and slavery, but also because Black people had, quote, forged the kind of lives which people lived. And then 2 years later, when he's speaking at Michigan State University in 1971, he gives a series of lectures that cover everything from soap operas to literature and sports, and he really found a lot of appeal in soap operas. There were 2 points that he made I think that are important. One, that Black power in distilling 2 centuries of progressive thought represented something politically new. And second, that Black intellectual production had transformed the study of human society. In his first lectures, he described Black power as a political banner that encapsulated things like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, life, liberty, equality, fraternity, proletarians of the world unite. Hopefully this works well. Yeah, so this is him on Black power. Black power means the summation of all these historical slogans applied to the present day. It is not proletariats of the world unite, no sir. It is all the Black people of the world unite. Power to the people, the Black people. Not only to the Black skin, because in the Caribbean and Africa, a whole lot of people are ruling who have Black skin, and they are very hostile to the concept of Black power because they know it means power to the people. Black power had no sense unless it means power to ordinary people. And you can hear here him echoing Walter Rodney's lectures that are contained in Groundings with My Brothers. This is where Black studies would play a crucial role. Again, noting the importance of Du Bois, the works of Richard Wright, Aimé Césaire, Alexander Dumas, James amplified his thinking about Du Bois and said, quote, you cannot write the history of slavery and the development of the independence of the American territories without putting at the center the history of the San Domingo Revolt. Then he would go on, how can you write a history of the French Revolution and the tremendous changes that it made, or write the history of the United States and the Civil War if you're not able to write the history of Black people in the US? What was at issue then was something beyond merely studies of Black people. The question was whether the work one undertakes sits comfortably alongside, yet neatly sequestered from, other disciplines and bodies of knowledge, or whether that work transforms knowledge as such. Thus, much like his sense that post-colonial Caribbean societies could not simply assume control of colonial mechanisms of rule, he was concerned that Black studies would focus too heavily on institutional legitimation and lose sight of its potential to elaborate a new way of thinking about the world. And it's not coincidental, I would argue, that Sylvia Wynter's 2006 essay, How We Mistook the Map for the Territory, takes up this same question about the institutionalization of Black studies and how it departs from the project that emerged out of Black Power. And this is a quote from that in slightly edited form. The reincorporation of Black studies into the liberal universalist mainstream by its reinvention as African American studies, as only one ethnic studies variant among a diverse range of others, all contrasted with, at the same time as they are integrated into, the ostensible universalism of Euro-American-centered mainstream scholarship. What is lost for Wynter is the challenge that Black studies posed early on to establish fields of knowledge where, in her words, Western bourgeois man is presented as the model of the human. And she highlights the need to contemplate Black studies' relationships to the disciplines. And I would suggest that unlike a concern with interdisciplinarity, intellectual projects like New World Group and Black Studies, when done well, allow one to ask questions that are not bound by the norms of any discipline. You see this in James's work across a range of genres, Wynter's work across genres. So what I'm getting at here is that our intellectual inquiries, if we are taking this charge up, are guided by the questions that we ask. And those questions and guide our use of the ensemble of concepts, methodological protocols, and debates available across the disciplines. And this is also, and this is kind of echoing a point that both Jafari and Juliet have made, this question of someone being lauded but ignored. This habit within Black studies to do theory in a way that you may use the phrases or concepts that you invoke them, but you don't use them to think through your own questions. And so those concepts or phrases do the work of thinking for you. Or Afro-pessimism's emphasis on Blackness and ontological anti-Blackness and the corresponding emphasis on slavery over Black life, or the Black as a figure as opposed to Black people, limiting our ability to understand the structures of governance, value systems, modes of thoughts, and the actors responsible for our current predicament. And so I want to end by going to Stuart Hall, a couple of passages in his Familiar Stranger, which I find interesting. This is at the very beginning, and this is, it's shocking to read it, right? Although I believe in theory as an indispensable critical tool, I have never been interested in producing theory. And in any case, I am not a theorist of any rank in this age of theory. So we all kind of get why that is so odd. And this other quote a little later on, I shifted from thinking of theory as the search for certainty of all-embracing totalities to the necessity of recognizing the power of contingency in historical processes and explanations. Now, I want to suggest in closing that I think Hall is registering here a sense of, when one says they do theory, often what is marked is not the degree to which one takes up a particular question or set of questions and thinks them through systematically over an extended period of time, but one is marking their theological commitment to the ideas or frames of a given thinker in a way that absolves them of needing to explain their own work, of needing to develop their own ideas. In Familiar Stranger, Hall recounts kind of an example which may make sense, hopefully. The impact of the 1938 labor rebellions in Jamaica on his role as an intellectual. And for his middle-class brown Jamaican milieu, 38 suggested social collapse, but for him it inaugurated, quote, a world of new possibilities. And he saw those possibilities in the writings of George Lamming and Derek Walcott to transform the novel into a Caribbean form, and in the tension and jazz between structure and innovation, which him presented freedom as movement as kind of a capacious way of thinking about 1938. And for him, this allowed him to think about, quote, a world of new possibilities in which blackness itself came to function as a resource for the future. And repeating, a world in which blackness itself came to function as a resource for the future. And it's here, in Hall's view, I could see C.L.R. James reading that and saying, I cannot think of black studies in any other way. Thank you.
Thank you, Jafari, Juliet, and Minkah, for your many, many, many provocations. I am not going to serve the role of a discussant here. That's not my charge anyway. I'm really pessimistic about the role of discussants in these kinds of things. They often become just exercises in self-indulgent colonial ways of being, which we're trying to disrupt here. But I will say, just really quick, I love the way in which these presentations are asking us to anchor our frames of analysis in the peripheries, right, in the black space of other Americas, and the peripheries of the peripheries, and to evoke the example of Beatriz Nascimento, an overlooked figure in Afro-Latin American thought, right? Not as a project of inclusion, no, not as a project to sort of say, oh, right, yes, we should read Nascimento. We should read some of the folks that were mentioned here in our presentations today, right? But really as a project of transformation, right? A rewriting the way we think about black thought and black politics and black ways of being in the disco halls and in the Palladium and other spaces, right? And so I think these presenters here, and I'm going to turn it over to you folks now, really asking us to think about what the project of transformation looks like, not by just invoking, but really engaging with some of our ancestors. And there are plenty more for us to study and examine and engage with and spend time with. And really, I think that's our charge here as we do, to paraphrase Jackie Alexander, the work that's necessary for us now. So I think we'll turn it over to questions and comments. Do we have a microphone? Are we doing that today? Okay. Yes, lovely Sharon Harris will pass the mic to you. So raise your hands and let's hear from you. Huh. Oh, we'll wait.
Oh, we're good.
They'll come.
Come on, somebody has a question.
We got one right there. You got Deb.
You should call on people.
Yeah, just call on people. Yeah.
So thank you, everyone, for a really wonderful panel. I guess the question I have is kind of loosely formulated in my head, but I wanted to sort of hear from all of you about what you think is the sort of kind of facilitating role of the university in all of these different threads. Because the university sort of comes up, like, you know, CUNY is the host for, you know, the conference that is sort of your turning point, right? That all of these scholars are sort of passing through the university space in one way or another. And so it sort of facilitates these ideas, but yet we all know the university is an institution. It is a kind of, you know, unwieldy space, and sometimes it can be a stifling space. And I wanted to kind of hear you all think through what that sort of dual role is in the various genealogies that you trace of kind of both help and hindrance that the university provides, given that we are, in fact, in another one of these unwieldy university spaces. So any one of you can take that on. I would love to hear you think through it.
I'm trying to remember Dylan Rodriguez's quote about, I think it was that our relationship to the university should be a felonious one, or that is that our job is to find a way to use the resources of the university for these projects, and not have these projects squarely in the university. So of course, doing the work that I do and looking toward the folks that I'm looking toward, DJs, drag queens, dancers on the dance field, poets who are doing all of those things, sex workers, who are doing this work, who end up at Black Nations, Queer Nations, right? Who organize Fierce, who do this sort of work. It helps to keep me honest in terms of what my work should be and what my relationship to the university should be. So I would say as a space that we can use, if we can use it, And when it becomes less useful, then we turn from it and we try to figure out another way to do it. One of the things that Frank has pointed out is that it's been very useful for me to see the way that various senior people, as I was coming up, have used the university, the way Ted did, the way Manning did, right? The way Mancha Giawara did at NYU when I was there. A very different model, the model of the Black good life, I call it, right? Effective, incisive in a different way. The way Carol Boyce Davies used FIU. Happened to be there. Also, I've sort of been like cycling through these things, that they're used in particular ways for particular times at particular moments. The ways we try to maintain and build at Yale in another very different formation that was very useful, that now may have lost its. That was very useful at the time, right? But thinking through and being nimble about what's next by remaining connected to the actual work of it, right?
Yeah, I would just briefly, one of the interesting things about this story with James is he teaches from 69 to at least 72 at FCC, and he's paid about $25,000 a year, which in 2019 money is about $160,000. This is the most money he ever made in his life. He was always supported by organizations and people. So in his lecture, when he first gets there, he's like, yeah, I'll come and teach in your Black Studies program, but I don't think this is really going to do what you want it to do. And I think it's him registering the sense of the university as a job that's giving him a pension. He's late in life, but he doesn't see it as a place where you're going to, in and of itself, lead some kind of drastic social change. And this is why he turns to Du Bois as this one who's carrying out this work in the NAACP, crisis, his scholarship, that's always politically directed. And I think you say the same thing about Stuart Hall, in that he leaves the university, he works in Open University, which has a much different orientation to its students, who is teaching, how it's teaching. And it's, I think I was kind of deliberate in really drawing on people who also don't have degrees, don't have PhDs, but nonetheless are these profound thinkers. And so all three of them have found the university useful in different ways, and I think really rooted the core of their work and their mission outside of it. And so to the extent that Black Studies can maintain that commitment to something beyond just being another department in the university, a mode of legitimation of people's careers, which I think is valuable. I enjoy my check. But nonetheless, if that is the end of one's project, then it becomes, I think, problematic.
And if I could just add something to that, I mean, I think that there's an interesting question there too about, right, how do we think about this when we try to think about the role of the university transnationally? And here I'm thinking about, right, what does it mean, for example, to publish work on Afro-Latin American studies in English, and then, right, it has limited reach in Latin America if it's not in Spanish or Portuguese, right? So how are we thinking about, the sort of politics of intellectual production that we're engaged in? And then, at the same time as I think that the university can serve as a sort of important space for, I'm thinking about somebody like, Augias do Nascimento, right, who holds the first, chair in Puerto Rican studies at SUNY Buffalo, I think, one of the SUNYs. And I think about how the fact that he is, has been translated and is probably, most widely thought might have something to do with having that space, or that connection to U.S. academia, as opposed to somebody like Beatriz Nascimento, right? And the sort of marginalization of Afro-Brazilian scholars within Brazil. So I think there's both the possibility of the university serving as a space where you can help, and Black studies spaces in particular can help, remedy some of the exclusions, right, in other regions and countries. But at the same time, how do we also do that without replicating, the sort of production of knowledge that is is one directional and replicates kind of these north-south, inequalities.
There's another, yes.
For me?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, great. I just wanted to add to the conversation about universities, because if I think about what's happening in the UK with our institutions, one of the things that's happening is a fundamental questioning of the value of the institution for the student. I mean, obviously, you talked very eloquently about the ways in which we as researchers kind of continue and buy into the university system and organize great things like this, but actually we can also step and be on the periphery of it. But the student with debt, with financial burden, where in effect the institution is creating that burden for that student, it seems to me that there is a very clear questioning process that's happening about the value of that body of knowledge and that institutional's kind of positioning. And so really it then begs the question about whether we are contributing to a decolonizing of minds in a way. And I just wanted to get a kind of response from you, given your wonderful papers about the different contributions that are being made around Black studies.
Yeah. She wants to respond.
Do you have a thought?
I'm thinking about for two reasons. Learning how to teach a different population of students at the university, where my job, as I understood it at Yale, was to prepare people to enter the professorate. I saw myself mostly as a graduate teacher and preparing undergraduates to understand the greatness of Black studies and Black queer studies. And now my students want a different value for their dollar, lots of dollar, right? And my responsibility then is going back to my understanding of myself as an activist before I was an academic, that my job is to conscientize them. That they think that they want is something usable that they can trade, and what I give them is Ann Petrie, or I give them something for their soul, give them something that can help them when they are on the job and something crazy happens. I give them a model, right? So part of this thing is about approaching my job as people in my family do who work blue collar. You know, you're a bus driver, but what you really do is that you are the president of the NAACP or the president of the usher board, right? So if I think of myself that way, there are things that I have to do to to maintain my job. If we're not talking about the scholarship, but I can model for them what a Black professional who still has a soul looks like. And that's the value that I can give them, even though that's not the one that they think they're paying for, and it's certainly not the one that the university thinks they're paying me for. Right? Thank you for helping us too.
Yeah, I mean, I think, can I just jump in here real quick? I mean, there's a way in which there's all kinds of questions of the university, the function, the value of a university degree, and that comes from more nefarious concerns or elements in our society, right, in which is just try to just do away with the university because, it's no longer, has the dangerous potential to no longer serve just white people, as it did in welfare state America, right? So, but if there's one good thing about this historic moment, is that it's prompting all kinds of questions, right, that are coming from other elements, right? And so, and I think that's been happening here and all over the place, right? I mean, there's some of the concerns that we have in IRAAS and AAADS. And I think, in addition to modeling, professional with a soul, a Black soul, one of the things I think we try to do is to sort of, encourage our students to be knowledge producers, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that they got to get PhDs either, right? And so I think that, that work is still important, because if not, then we just capitulate to the kind of neoliberal monetizing of our knowledge. And so the students really are the ones who are going to have to carry us to the next stage. And if we don't bring them on board and allow them to do the transformative work that our ancestors were doing, that we heard about today, then we're in trouble.
I would just add, I think, this is, like when we think about the Fees Must Fall movement and kind of how you don't have that in the US, and for a number of reasons, but one of the questions in terms of decolonizing the university or decolonizing the curriculum, which I think is different than kind of a broader, more general decolonial project, at least as I understand it, is it kind of begs the question, how can you decolonize an implicitly colonial institution in terms of its knowledge practices, in terms of its history, its where it's rooted, and what it does in terms of how we think about the world and ourselves. So I'm thinking about this Talib Kweli quote. He's like, you get something like, cats toast death and pain like slaves on a ship, talking about who got the flyest chains. And if we are thinking about these institutions as somehow inherently going to do the kind of work of, say, like knowledge production, that you have to get a PhD and you have to do it in this kind of way, and this is the only way that you have value, then we end up in that kind of cycle where we're spinning a wheel and we aren't really actually making any progress around these kinds of questions. But if we're thinking about how to get someone, as Jafari is saying, who their main identity is a deacon board, their main identity is their lodge or some fraternal order or whatever the case may be, and take what we have to give, and they can then use that in other realms. And so it may be knowledge production in non-PhD kinds of ways. It may be knowledge production in the arts or in a local newspaper or, in any number of ways. I think that is probably the more compelling part, is how can we take this and engage with people who aren't in the university, or who are in the university, but their relationship is very conditional. They may be here for a semester, but what connection can we build?
I would just add that I think that there's also, I think there is undoubtedly, as everybody has said, kind of a model of the sort of neoliberal, you're here to get, certain things out of the university, and they're sort of consumers. But I also think, and maybe this comes from me from being in political theory and political science, that, the way to think about what we do is that our job is to help, turn people into thoughtful citizens, right? That beyond teaching them, like, what the structure of the government is or something like that, it's about how do you become a thoughtful citizen, both in the space of, the larger political community, but also of your, the space in which you are. So, for example, I've been teaching a course this semester in gender, slavery, and freedom, and using it to talk about both the legacy of slavery, the impact of slavery in the United States. And one of the things that I do is I talk about, because I'm in Rhode Island, right, the presence of slavery, its impact on Rhode Island and New England, and also at Brown, and how it shaped the institution. What does that mean for us as part of the institution, and for the institution needing to reckon with that? But also using it to think about broader questions that aren't just are about, like, do we have a duty to resist injustice, right? And on whom does that duty fall, right? And so I think that as Jafari says, sometimes we do the work that maybe it's not what they think, we're there for, but that's how I think about, certainly my teaching, right, as its broader purpose.
Critical.
Steve?
So I'm building on the first two questions. I'm very interested in how, it's more specific, because you sort of answered it already. How do you use or plan to use your scholarship in the peripheries? So not just to the students, but also in those communities that you study.
I'm going to go first again.
So in terms of and particularly now, because my work is more thoroughly focused on Caribbean intellectuals, and I'm not from the Caribbean, and I don't spend a good deal of time. I've made some connections, but I don't know that I can necessarily translate that on the ground there. But in terms of what I do try and encourage my students to do is to think about different kinds of things that might interest them. So I've had a number of students who've expressed interest in music and hip hop, and so I developed this course on the worlds of hip hop. And so that's trying to take some of these insights and some of the ways of thinking about freedom and think about what does it look like when, or what does it mean to think about the development of hip hop is creating this space for people to interact and engage with one another as a practice of freedom in a particular context that maybe that doesn't exist or hip hop doesn't function that way anymore. But then how do we take that and apply it in different kinds of ways, or how might they apply it in different kinds of ways? And then increasingly, at least in Austin, particularly in my position as director of this center, is trying to make connections with a local library that serves largely the Black community to see to what degree that can translate, or what I do in the classroom and at the institution can translate on the ground. And I admit that I don't have the same kind of involvement and political connections that I envisioned myself having when I went to grad school, that I was going to, teaching adult education programs or whatever, and things like that. But I think there are a number of efforts around at Houston Tillerson, a Black college in Austin. I think NYU Rutgers has one that's teaching in prisons, in a prison to the classroom kind of program. So I think those are some of the ways that I see it as being a possibility.
I think that particularly because, this part of my current work, which has been really about, historical in the sense of trying to do this kind of intellectual history of Afro-Latin American thought, the way that I think of that, and I'm thinking about how to bring that to the people that I'm writing about is to think about, how do we help create resources that are free, that are available in the languages that people need them, for people who need and want to know the history of Black populations in the Americas, right? And so I think about my scholarship in those ways, and think about, how can I contribute to those efforts, and to efforts to try to institutionalize Black studies in Latin America, frankly, which is, which has been even further behind than the U.S. in having those kinds of spaces within, higher education in particular. And so I think about, I don't think that is the only thing that we can do, or that it's the most important thing necessarily, but I think it's the thing that for me is the clearest connection between this kind of, work on intellectual history of Black Latin Americans, and hopefully have it sort of serve as a resource for people who are trying to figure out, the history of their communities, and rethink the history of the countries in which they find themselves.
You can give me a skip, Stevie? Well, we've had this discussion before, right? And I think I'm of two minds. One is that because I started out as an activist and became an academic, I've had tremendous anxiety about this question, right? Where I belong, what I ought to be doing. And what I came to is that what I was doing for the first part of my career was not aimed to the margins, but was writing into the scholarly record from that position, and that was honest in terms of my own journey, my own training, and my trying to fill in. Minkah talked about this revindicationist project of yesteryear. I felt myself really part of that, and I still feel that in many ways, because I think that the insights that I'm talking about, people already know. So this whole notion of write something that your grandmother can read is actually backward to me, because she already knows. She doesn't. I'm actually telling y'all. I'm really telling y'all what this is. And I'm not my grandma, and I'm marginal kind of, but I'm not really. I'm actually I have imbibed all that this place gave me as a graduate student. Some poison, some really wonderful stuff, right? And so I think that that this is the way that I've seen my work, and have, because my ethnographic work means being with people constantly and having to ask them through our exchange, what is it you need from me? I don't know that people have not told me, we need you to say this, or we need you to make this, this information. On some occasions, I have done translation work, that is translation from academic-ese to regular language in English, and then tried some in Spanish, which went poorly, and paid somebody else to do it, right? But what people want, and a lot of my respondents wanted was, can you help me write this grant to get this money? Can you show up with me to a meeting at the Ministry of Culture and say that you're a professor from the U.S.? Can you, right? These sort of leveraging, these sort of leveraging positions, which is not the same as what I'm expected to do and say, well, I'm always, I'm for the people and I don't use that theoretical language. And I do. I love it. It's beautiful. This is like cultural worker, yeah, but yes, and at the same time, Tony Cade wasn't like us getting a deposit in their account every month, and I don't ever want to front as if, right? I know what it's like. Being an activist for me meant being a waiter, a caterer, a sales girl, et cetera, right? Right? And so I don't romanticize it.
There's so much more to say here, but I think we're over time. So I again want to thank our panelists. For these initial provocations, we're just getting started today. I mean, we don't have concurrent sessions, which is wonderful. So, I mean, in many ways, we're just kind of having a multi-day conversation that will continue this afternoon at 1:15 with the Diasporic Politics panel from 1:15 to 3, and then after that, the theoretical turn. So you see all sorts of overlapping discussions happening here today. I want to thank you all for coming, and again, thank our panelists, and we'll see you this afternoon.
When you said Nascimento, I was like, what's he?